They said that Ukraine would lose the war. It was inevitable. Russia was simply too big, too powerful. A military superpower against a minnow needed the West to give itself even a fighting chance of surviving more than a month or two. How things have changed. Ukraine is now a master of war, and it's grown so powerful that even the US needs its help in Iran. The country that once relied on others is now ready to become the nation that its allies can rely on in every aspect of modern warfare. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has made an announcement. For the first time in Ukraine's history, the courage of our warriors and the resilience of our people are sufficiently armed to defend against Russian strikes, Zelensky said during an address to mark Ukrainian Arms Makers' Day on April 13th. What this means is that Ukraine has combined the support that it's received from so many allies since Putin invaded with the development of its domestic defense industry, become the sort of powerhouse that Putin always feared it would become. Now Ukraine is stronger than it ever has been at any point during its history, and Zelensky is quick to let the world know about it. This is not the first time that Russia has come to destroy Ukrainian statehood and freedom, Ukraine's president said of Russia's invasion of its territory before adding, "But now Ukrainians are in a stronger position than ever before, stronger than in 2014, stronger than in the 20th century, and stronger than at any earlier time." For some, these might seem like empty words. That's how Putin wants the rest of the world to hear what Zelensky has to say. For years, Russia's president has been trying to craft the narrative that Russia is the all-conquering power that will take Ukraine any day now. It's been over 4 years, and any day now hasn't arrived yet. Still, Russia tells its own story of dominance. Even as recently as the end of March, Putin was giving Ukraine a 2-month deadline to get out of the Donbass, or else Russia's forces would sweep through and take it. Again, Russia has been trying to do that for years. It hasn't succeeded yet, and it has a whole fortress belt to topple before it does. The reality that we're seeing on the ground is that what Zelensky claims Ukraine to be is precisely what it has become, and the results speak for themselves. In March, which is the month when Russia launched the spring offensive that is supposed to lead to the fall of the Donbass by the end of 2026, Ukraine has beaten Russia in every category that matters. On the long-range front, Ukraine intercepted close to 90% of Russia's drones and the vast majority of its missiles. And as only 1 in every 10 Russian drones was finding its mark, Ukraine came out on top in long-range attacks for the first time since the war began. Ukraine launched 885 more deep strike drones at Russia than Russia launched at Ukraine in March, hitting a staggering total of 7,347, which amounts to 237 unmanned aerial vehicles attacking Russian territory every single day. Records fell left and right throughout all of March. On March 17th, Russia endured more casualties than it has on any day in 2026 so far, as 1,710 of Putin's soldiers fell to Ukraine's weapons. By the end of the month, Russia had lost 35,351 of its soldiers to death or injury, which is a high watermark for the year so far, and one of the highest monthly totals yet recorded in over 4 years of fighting. April was also the month when Russia's total casualty count climbed past the 1.3 million mark. And in Donetsk, which is part of the Donbass that Russia still has to try and wrest away from Ukraine, Putin's forces are now in the position where they're losing 316 soldiers for every square kilometer of Ukraine that they are managing to claim, which is equivalent to 0.38 square miles. So Russia is losing somewhere in the region of 900 soldiers for every square mile that it takes. Not that it's taking many. March saw Russia make absolutely no territorial gains, which is the first time that has happened for 2.5 years. Every gain that Russia managed to make was counteracted by Ukraine making gains of its own, leading to Russia losing over 35,000 soldiers for absolutely no progress forward. These are the results that Ukraine achieves now that it has everything that it needs to defend itself. And in a few minutes, we're going to be explaining why the United States should be paying very close attention to what Ukraine is doing, as Ukraine could end up making all the difference in Iran. But before we get to that, Zelensky had plenty more to say about Ukraine's transformation into a military power that is more than capable of defending itself against Russia. Today, our diplomatic strikes are no longer a sensation, although each time it is a very fair and very pleasant piece of news. Today, our Ukrainian drones have fundamentally changed approaches to warfare, and once everything was decided by the quantity of artillery, now the battlefield is undoubtedly the bravery of the infantry and the scale of drone application, Ukraine's president declared. He added that Ukraine has developed its own electronic warfare or EW systems, and that the work the country has done up to this point has done more than put it on a level footing with Russia. Ukraine is now achieving parity with its partners. Those who give to Ukraine are now receiving from the nation. As Ukraine works to develop new strategies to overcome Russia's ballistic missiles, it's building defense partnerships with allies in Europe and elsewhere. Many in Europe are now thinking about this, Zelensky says of Russia's ballistic threat. That shouldn't be a surprise. Russia's actions in Ukraine have led to many in Europe theorizing that Putin and his cronies want to turn their attention to Europe and its NATO nations if they manage to win the war in Ukraine. Ballistic missiles would be key to any Russian assault against a European nation. For Zelensky, that fact alone creates an opportunity for Ukraine and its European allies to work together on developing countermeasures. Ukraine can be this leader, Zelensky says when talking about a ballistic missile project. And again, Zelensky comes with the receipts to prove that Ukraine can step up as one of the key defenders not only of Europe, but of nations outside of the continent who are being affected by the actions of Russia and the nations that align with Putin's cause. We feel this very concretely now when countries in Europe, the Middle East, the Gulf, Asia, Africa, all are very interested in Ukrainian weapons, Ukrainian military expertise coming to their defense, Zelensky declared. And he made it clear that Ukraine has a model in place to make all of this happen. We'll get into that model in a moment. There is something in what Zelensky said there that offers another sign that the US needs Ukraine to help in Iran. Two things, actually. Ukraine is working with nations in the Gulf region and in Africa. In the wake of the US launching Operation Epic Fury against Iran, the Iranian regime closed the Strait of Hormuz and started sending drones into the territory of its Gulf neighbors. Hundreds of Iran's Shahid drones have been launched, and these are precisely the types of drones that Russia has been receiving and then building upon to attack Ukraine. Counters for these drones have been created by Ukraine, including low-cost interceptors, that are a big reason why Ukraine's drone interception rate is so high right now. Gulf nations have been taking notice. Ukraine has signed decade-long deals with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, all of which want to make use of the weapons that Ukraine is building so they can defend themselves against Iran. It gets even deeper. Back in March, Zelensky revealed that Ukraine had sent over 200 of its anti-drone experts to the Middle East to fulfill its end of the defense deals that it struck. Those experts are doing more than training Ukraine's new Gulf allies. Zelensky himself has revealed that they have been directly involved in the destruction of Russian Shahid drones, which means that Ukrainian soldiers are now helping to defend the Gulf against Iran. As for Africa, RFI has broken the news that Ukraine now maintains a trio of bases inside Libya, which it may have used to conduct strikes against Russia's Shadow Fleet assets in the Mediterranean Sea. Again, this is all due to what Ukraine has to trade. Drone expertise and weapons have become hot commodities, and Ukraine is using them to build the types of relationships that it never would have had if Putin hadn't forced Ukraine to turn itself into a military power. Russia only has itself to blame. A war that was supposed to be over in days has lasted for years, and it's led to Ukraine reaching the point where it can not only defend itself against Russia, but it can also work with and provide for others. All of this has been made possible by what Zelensky dubs the G2G, or government-to-government model. With these kinds of agreements, Ukraine focuses on building trust with a partner's government first, then it moves on to everything else later. Contracts between enterprises within the nation in question are only negotiated once an intergovernmental framework has been put in place, which is what we're seeing now in the Gulf, Libya, and many countries in Europe. Ukraine has the model, it has the weapons, and it's willing to share them to help its partners. Here's where the US comes into play. Right now, the US is embroiled in a war with Iran that is presenting it with problems that Ukraine is perfectly positioned to solve. The US needs Ukraine in Iran. But before we explain how and why, this is a reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. So, the US needs Ukraine. Why? We'll need to cover some quick background before we dig into the question. On April 13th, the US announced that it's going to enforce a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz after a fragile ceasefire with Iran fell apart. Iran won't stop its nuclear program, the US claims. So it intends to turn what has been a key piece of leverage that Iran has held throughout Operation Epic Fury against it. A blockade by the US means very different things than the one that Iran had in place. Iran uses fast boats, the US uses warships. And while this disparity in naval power should mean that the US is able to successfully blockade Iran's ports, it also creates problems. For a start, warships are far bigger targets than fast boats. When those ships have to stay in the same place for an extended period, as is the case when they're being used to create a blockade, they become vulnerable to Iran's Shahid drones. Furthermore, the fact that this blockade has even been created at all tells us that the Iran war is reigniting. US President Donald Trump has already threatened that anybody who attempts to attack a US vessel will be blown to hell, which tells us that he's more than ready to pull the trigger on conducting yet more of the types of airstrikes that have led to Iran to attack so many of its Gulf neighbors in response. Those affected Gulf states have formed partnerships with Ukraine for a reason. Now, the US should do the same for that very reason. One of the greatest threats that Iran poses to any enemy, be it the US or anyone else, is its Shahid drones. The US already knew this way back at the beginning of Operation Epic Fury, and it has called on Ukraine for help in the past. At least that's according to Zelensky. On March 5th, Ukraine's president said there had been requests from the American side to help it deal with Iran's Shahid drones, which resulted in Zelensky providing instructions to Ukrainian specialists to provide whatever means necessary to help the US and its Gulf allies fend off Iran's attacks. At the time, Trump seemed very open to the offer, stating, "I'll take any assistance from any country." Ukraine saw an opportunity to make a deal: interceptor drones for Patriot missiles that Ukraine could use to defend itself against Russian ballistic missiles. Trump's reaction to that request was to reject help from Ukraine. But now, as the situation in the Strait of Hormuz heats up again and the US warships are being ordered to sail into positions that make them vulnerable to Shahid drones, the US has to face up to a clear fact: it needs Ukraine. And there are 5 reasons why. First up is something that we've already touched on several times. Ukraine has become the global master in drone warfare. The Gulf states know it, which is why they're signing 10-year defense deals with Ukraine. The very Shahid drones that Iran is now using against the US, its bases, and likely soon American warships are the weapons that Ukraine has been dealing with for much of the war. Iran provided Shahids to Russia. For Ukraine, that makes Iran complicit in the crime of aggression against Ukraine, as the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs puts it. However, it also means that Ukraine has been forced to come up with countermeasures to the very weapons that the US needs to overcome. One of those counters is interceptor drones, and they are the second reason why the US needs Ukraine right now. According to the American Foreign Policy Council, Ukraine has been developing interceptor drone technology throughout its war with Russia. Now, Ukraine has the tech down to a fine science. Tiny interceptor drones use a combination of kinetic energy and, in some cases, small warheads to take out Shahid drones that are much larger than they are. In January alone, Ukraine deployed 40,000 of its interceptors, which is proof that Ukraine is able to build these defense weapons at scale. Further proof comes from the fact that Ukraine can now build around 1,500 interceptor drones every day, creating a monthly output of about 45,000. The odds are high that it will be able to build more, assuming that it has investment from a country like the US. So, Ukraine has the expertise and the tools that the US needs in Iran right now. The third reason the US needs Ukraine is that the price is right. The Council adds that it costs Ukraine somewhere between $300 and $1,200 to build an interceptor drone. That's peanuts in the context of the US defense budget. And even when you add a markup for exporting these interceptors to the US, Ukraine's interceptor drones are far cheaper than the Patriot missiles that the US has often used to stop Iran's Shahid drones in their tracks. These missiles are effective, but they also cost about $4 million each, which is far too much to spend on Iranian drones that cost $20,000 to $50,000 to build. Even America's own attempts at interceptor drones, such as the Lucas, cost far more than Ukraine's proven solution. A single Lucas drone costs roughly the same as a Shahid. A Ukrainian interceptor costs as much as 66 times less than the lowest priced Shahid. That brings us to the fourth reason why the US needs Ukraine in Iran. Ukraine is so much more than a producer of cheap interceptor drones. You'll have picked up on that already due to Zelensky's comments about how effective Ukraine's defense industry has become and how many of Ukraine's partners are looking for weapons of all types from Ukraine. But let's put some numbers on Ukraine's innovation. On April 14th, United 24 Media reported that Zelensky unveiled a video showcasing 56 weapon systems that Ukraine has developed itself. Of the 56, 31 were drones, 7 were missile systems, 4 were electronic warfare tools, and 6 were robotic ground platforms. Other innovations included 4 new types of armored vehicles, a trio of unmanned naval systems, and even a mobile air defense turret. Think about this list of weapons for a moment. Almost every single one is something that the US could use in its war with Iran. Beyond the interceptors, the US could be using Ukrainian drones to strike Iranian positions and fast boats. It could be deploying unmanned naval systems against those boats, and a few mobile air defense units to go along with the defenses that are already built into America's warships would go a long way toward keeping those vessels safe in the Strait of Hormuz. Ukraine is the sort of innovator that can help the US deal with almost anything that Iran throws at it. But more important than that, and perhaps more crucial than any other reason why the US needs Ukraine than we've shared so far, is that Ukraine offers the US something that almost no other allies offer: support for Operation Epic Fury. Trump has regularly bemoaned the fact that America's NATO allies aren't willing to get involved with the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz or the war that the US started with Iran. NATO wasn't there when we needed them, and they won't be there if we need them again, Trump blared in the wake of a meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on April 8th. Whether that's true or not is up for debate. To this day, the US is the only nation for which NATO has invoked Article 5 of its charter, which was done so that the US could receive direct help from its NATO allies in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks. Many of those allies then went to war, first in Iraq and then Afghanistan, to help the US. But it's what Trump is saying, and it reveals that the US isn't getting the help that it might have anticipated when it launched Operation Epic Fury. But Ukraine wants to help. More than any other ally of the US, Ukraine has an axe to grind with Iran for supplying Shahed drones to Russia. On February 28th, which is when the US launched Operation Epic Fury, Zelensky himself took to X to share his opinion. He pointed out that Russia has used over 57,000 Shahed-type drones against Ukraine, which Russia wouldn't have had if not for Iran. It's important that the United States is acting decisively. Whenever there is American resolve, global criminals weaken. This understanding must also come to the Russians, Zelensky said, adding that he believes that America's actions will ultimately bring peace to the Middle East. Opportunistic? Perhaps. But it's about as strong a statement of support that the US has received for Operation Epic Fury from any nation that isn't directly involved in the war. So, what is the US waiting for? Ukraine has the antidote for Iran's Shahed drones. It can make that antidote cheaper than any other nation, and it's become one of the most innovative military powers in the world. Most importantly, Ukraine wants to help the US. Ukraine is the master of what the US needs most. Now it's ready to answer America's call, just as the US did when Ukraine was in its hour of need. The only barrier that seems to be standing in the way is the Trump administration. But perhaps Ukraine's expertise in other areas might convince the US to form a partnership. After all, it's not just weapons that Ukraine has to offer. Ukraine has also had to deal with a Black Sea blockade due to Russia's invasion, and it has a blueprint the US could follow to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Find out more about that blueprint and how Ukraine could help the US in this vital waterway in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to The Military Show to see more coverage of the Ukraine war and Operation Epic Fury. And thank you, as always, for watching.